Hey everyone, we've got a really fun episode coming up for you today. So I've got Eric Siron and Xavier Avrillier coming on the show to talk about Hyper-V and VMware. Yes, we're bringing back that age-old discussion of Hyper-V versus VMware, but we're going to be doing it in a kind of a fun manner, right? We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each. We're going to talk about how they fit in the industry and lots more coming up next on the Dojo Podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dojo Podcast, the podcast where we teach you the special skills needed to become the IT black belt within your organization. My name is Andy Syrewicze, your host, and with me I've got two great friends of mine. I've got Eric Siron and Xavier Avrillier. How's it going, guys?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks.
Good, good. Well, hey guys, just in case our viewers and listeners may not necessarily know who you guys are, let's go through some quick introductions. So real quick, Eric, why don't we start with you?
Hey everybody, Eric Siron. I'm Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center Management. I tend to work a great deal with Hyper-V in the public. I've done a number of articles and a handful of books on it, and I have been mostly seen on the Altaro blogs for a number of years now. So I'm getting into the podcasting too.
That's right, that's right. You've been on the blogs for a while. I think longer than me. I think you've been on there for what? It's got to be 8-9 years now, something like that.
I think it's longer than that. We'll have to do that math someday. Figure it out.
We'll have to do that math. That's right. So, all right. Well, thanks for being here, sir. As always, it's fun to have you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today. And then Xavier, why don't we do an introduction for you as well?
Hi guys. So I'm Xavier Avrillier. I'm an IT consultant, and I work mainly on VMware products. So mostly private clients. And I'm also working on the VMware Dojo for Altaro, so working blogs, some PowerCLI stuff as well, all that goodness.
Yeah, definitely. You've got a ton of great articles out on our VMware blog, and every time you put out a PowerCLI article, I've got to go look at it because I know PowerShell and PowerCLI have always been kind of like I don't want to say like a primary focus, but a little bit of a side passion of mine. And anything I can automate, like I want to. I don't want to do things manually. So anytime you have a PowerCLI blog out there, I'm like, ooh, I have to read it right now. So, all right. That's right. That's right. It's funny. My very first IT mentor, if I go way back, dating myself back into, this would be like 2003. The very first mentor I ever had in the IT space said the key to IT is laziness. Exactly. And it sounds horrible, but he's not wrong. You want to automate everything you can, right? But anyway, that's not what we're talking about today. So today, we are bringing back the, the age-old big debate of Hyper-V versus VMware. And yeah, some people are going to be like, oh God, here we go again. This debate's happened over and over again. And so yeah, I'm opening that can of worms again here, but I don't think it's going to be as combative as, comparisons in the past have happened. So, if I look at the three of us and kind of where we sit on the Altaro dojos and kind of our area of expertise, the way I look at it is, Eric, you're kind of the tried and true diehard Hyper-V guy. Xavier, you're kind of like you're clearly in the VMware side of the house. And I have pretty much for my entire enterprise IT career, I should say, I've kind of had a foot in both worlds. So I actually started as a VMware admin in 2007. So this had been like just after, GSX, whatever version 2 was. And I really cut my teeth with virtualization on ESX version 3 before they did the whole ESXi split, so I survived that entire transition. I got certified for vSphere version 4, vSphere version 5, and then I discovered Hyper-V when 2008 R2 really when 2012 came out, and really dove into that because I liked everything virtualization. So, and then at that point, I was the only guy in the entire service provider. We were a team of 20, 25 engineers. I was the only Hyper-V guy. I was the only one that knew anything about it. So I started getting all the Hyper-V tickets and projects. So I've very much been in both worlds. So I kind of, have a very kind of neutral approach between the two, I guess, is what I would say. Not that you guys don't, but, just again, speaking for myself, that's kind of where I'm at. So, well, let's go ahead and start with just kind of what are the new-ish things, right? And I mean, when we come to core infrastructure technologies like Hyper-V and vSphere, newish might be in the last year, maybe the last 2 years, because things tend to move a little bit slower in the infrastructure space, right? As far as cutting edge, features go. So I guess, Eric, we'll start with you. On the Hyper-V front, what are some of the more recent Hyper-V developments that you've seen in the last couple of years that really you see as kind of a big deal?
So before I answer that, I'm going to do the politicians thing and go back just a hair.
Oh boy!
I will not be. I will not be combative. I just want to put that. I'm not going to be combative. I do have issues with VMware, but they're personal. It's like me and VMware don't like each other very much. The product is fine, and if it suits you, then have at it. I'm not interested in arguing which product is better. To answer your actual question that you asked me, really, like my favorite thing is nested support for AMD, even though it may be too late as ARM starts to take over the world. But but the processor market is being shuffled. Intel is no longer just everybody buys Intel and there you go. Now you're seeing AMD and Azure even, and that's to see AMD deployed at that scale is a huge thing, right? And again, I'm kind of concerned that as ARM comes out and everybody starts like, is the x86 platform going to do it for us anymore? Yeah, but I'm really excited about that. I think that's cool. And other than that, what I'm gonna weasel out here. I'm gonna say the interesting thing is that Hyper-V has not changed much recently. It has kind of hit this maturity phase where now they are kind of dinging the bells, less than trying to give you core functionality that was missing for years and years and years. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I think just jumping in just real quick there, I think one of the key shifts that I've at least seen in the Hyper-V space in the last couple of years is you used to have this development model at Microsoft where they develop on-premise server first, and then those changes and learnings, as Microsoft loves to use that term, learnings get moved up into Azure. Now it's vice versa. Everything, all the new stuff starts in Azure and it gets pushed into the on-premises server product now. So I think that's been kind of a big shift, and that's definitely changed the direction of where some of the enhancements and improvements that I've seen over the last couple of years have gone. So kind of an interesting change there. So, all right, well, appreciate the insight there, Eric. And Xavier, on the VMware front, what do we have that's new? I know that at least from where I've been watching the vSphere news in the last 6 to 12 months, vSphere 7 is kind of, the big thing on the news front, correct?
Yeah. So things have been quite crazy actually for VMware in the last 2 years. Things have changed a lot. It's actually kind of hard to keep track because they are releasing products and features it's like every 2 months. So there's a new product name, a new product portfolio, and so it's getting tricky, But vSphere 7 brought a lot of stuff like Tanzu, VMware's integration of Kubernetes. You get like Kubernetes grid clusters, Kubernetes pods. So this shift towards containers, it's been going on for a few years now. Like when Docker started getting some traction back in 2012, I think, or something like that. People started to get interested, and then at some point VMware bought Pivotal, and then they invested a lot in this product and in Tanzu. So that seems to be where things are going. Big integration with the cloud providers, VMware Cloud and AWS, the Dell EMC Cloud as well. So yeah, lots of stuff. They've done VMware Cloud Foundation, which is the whole SDDC stack that you can deploy with like certified architecture type of things. So yeah, in terms of core features, they're always kind of improving like vMotion, DRS, all these all these historic features that have been around since like ESX3 we're talking about.
Right.
I think it's been around since the beginning or something.
Right.
And but yeah, it seems like now the big ticket item is not like the actual hypervisor. It's more all these side products that are kind of plugging in the hypervisor.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be kind of the case. Again, looking at both of the vendors, Microsoft and VMware in this case, right? It really seems like the core virtualization services they're really mature at this point, right? I mean, they've been around forever in IT terms. And like you said, Zav, the point now is kind of round out the feature set with all these different kind of auxiliary products, I guess I would say. You mentioned the Tanzu and the Kubernetes integration. I see Microsoft has now started doing that on the Windows Server side with their Azure Stack HCI deployment mechanism that they now have, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later in this talk. So it's, even though I hear the VMware versus Hyper-V debate a lot less now than I used to, you still see a lot of feature parity between the two ecosystems, right? One of them will come ahead with something new, then the other one will be right behind them. So there's still very much this cat and mouse thing going on between the two organizations, but definitely good to see that both of them are continuing to invest in the platform. So the other thing that I've kind of noticed on the Hyper-V side while I'm thinking of it, and maybe this is the same on the vSphere side, maybe you've got some information on this, Xavier, is that I know a lot of the improvements in Hyper-V were under the hood and really focused on mitigating some of the the processor vulnerabilities that have come out in the last couple of years. I don't know if vSphere had that same issue or not. I believe they did, because it was really a processor vulnerability, right, not an OS thing. But is there any information that you have on that particular front?
Yeah, so I assume you are referring to the Spectre meltdown issue with Intel. Yeah. So yeah, things were pretty bad actually. When it happened, I just started a new job as a VMware specialist for a client, and like 2 weeks after that, I get the Spectre meltdown on the whole of the infrastructure. So it was interesting times, and they were quite quick to respond. There were patches, but I assume it was pretty much the same with Hyper-V. You had to update the firmware, update the host. So yeah, it happened to all kinds of physical hosts, which was it was a pretty bad thing. And like you mentioned, Eric, about AMD, I think lots of companies they used to be a bit, chilly about buying AMD servers, but I think a lot of customers are now moving from Intel to AMD stacks because of that, especially. So, yeah, I
think that was kind of a wake-up call, right? Because all of a sudden it was like, holy crap, Intel is not infallible, right? Intel is not this, impenetrable juggernaut that everyone thought it was. But for the record, I'm not bad-mouthing Intel. It's just, it is what it is, right?
I will. I'll badmouth them all day.
Hey, we're not talking about their NICs. We're not talking about their NIC. Well, maybe we will be here shortly.
Can we talk about the Netport Express way back in early 2000s? Can we talk about that? I've never forgiven them. I'm just not going to.
Hey, based on a recent conversation you and I had, that I, as well as everyone else, have reason to really dislike Intel NICs right now. For those that are not aware, I've got an entire blog series. Actually, it'll probably end up being a series of videos. I was setting up Azure Stack HCI inside of my home lab using some, I don't want to say ancient, but older Intel-based server NICs. What is it? The i350 is, I think, what the NIC chipset is. It's a quad-port NIC. I mean, standard server NIC, nothing out of the ordinary. But Azure Stack HCI just kept, and that paired with the NIC driver, the NIC stack, it just kept exploding every time I try to set up an Azure Stack HCI cluster. I digress. I'm getting away from our topic here, but that was a pain point in the last couple of weeks here. I'm still not quite over it. I may need therapy before everything is said and done. Anyway, so moving on. Getting back to our core discussion are comparing VMware versus Hyper-V in 2021. Now, if I look back at previous years, anytime you see an article or a video or whatever about, you know, which of the two I should choose, it's often looked at through the lens of the config maximums, right? How many VMs can I run per node? What's the maximum number of memory per VM? How much memory per host can I have? It seemed like all of these articles always focused on that. And I guess, you know, I was putting together the outline for today's podcast. I'm looking at that and I'm just like, do any of us care anymore? I mean, the maximums are so insanely high. Only the Azures and the AWSs of the world are going to even worry about that. But that's my viewpoint. What do you guys think? Xavier, I'll start with you this time.
Well, to be honest, I don't think I've ever looked at the maximums because I never hit them. The only one I can think of that kind of could impact me to some level was back in VMFS 3 in vSphere 4 5. You had this, you know, this 2 terabyte maximum for VMFS data stores, in which that could be a limit to some level. But to be honest, all the other maximums, like the maximum number of hosts, can be managed from a cluster. Number of VMs, number of LUNs paths. I never really had to look at them because you don't even get close to that. And I think the evolutions of maximums kind of follow the evolution of needs. So what was okay back in 2010, if you run like vSphere 4 nowadays, you're going to have trouble. But if you run vSphere 4 in 2010, then you're fine. And I think now the maximum for VMFS data stores is something like 62 or 64 terabytes, something like that. So you may seem it's crazy. It's really big for nowadays. You don't need 62 terabytes, but who knows? Maybe in 5-10 years, you're going to have petabyte data stores, and you're going to think, well, 62 terabytes, it's like my cache. So, I don't think maximums are really relevant to compare products. It's just they have to put them out there. So
that way people don't try to do something stupid, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You know, support and all these things.
Yep. Exactly. Eric, any thoughts?
Well, I'm sure there are some people watching right now who are like, oh yeah, those I really need that, but I bet they're not very many.
Right.
So what really I think I want to kind of harp on that respect is that you've got people at both Microsoft and VMware who are sitting there tasked with make it bigger.
Right.
I think their resources could be put to better use on something else. And then, you know, when we get into videos like these and people are sniping at each other, it's just like you're arguing about something that matters to less than 5% of the human population. So this is not a good place for us to expend our energy, is what I think.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of where I ended up with it too. Like I said, I just, you know, like you said, Xavier, like I don't even look at the maximums anymore because like I'm nowhere near them, right? And you know, where you mentioned the 2 terabytes VMDK file size limit, I remember running into that. But even in that situation, there were workarounds for it, right? Like, okay, if you really need it, we can present, you know, two terabytes VMDKs to the OS. And then there's ways in software to present it as a single volume, right? So, I mean, there's ways around it. But yeah, I don't think I've ever been in a situation where it was like, okay, I'm up against a wall and there's, you know, I've hit the limit. I don't even know if I have run into anyone that has hit any sort of config limit myself. So anyway, like I said, you know, having any kind of VMware versus Hyper-V discussion, the config maximums always come up, so I wanted to make sure we covered it. So now we'll move on to the next favorite topic in this discussion, and that is licensing. Everyone's favorite topic, right? Everyone loves licensing. Eric, if I remember correctly, you've written ebooks about licensing, if I remember correctly.
I have. It's just, I mean, I want to give them the most benefit of the doubt that I can. When you're talking about something that costs, you know, $10 million to produce SKU number 1, and then like 8 cents to produce every SKU after that, it's hard to figure out how to properly monetize it. It really is. So I try not to be too hard on people, because you sit down and figure out licensing yourself. How would you license it? And you're going to wind up with all these silly things too. It's just, this is how we got there. So I don't want to be too hard on them, but it is super complicated. The big change was a few years, because it used to be you would license Windows Server by the hardware box, by the motherboard, essentially. And then a little while ago, they switched that to per core licensing, and they made it really weird.
Even worse.
It's like it's not just per core; it's like per core pair, even if you don't necessarily have a pair, and it's a skull splitter. And I think they should not have done that. But the problem, I think, and we'll probably touch on this in a bit, is that it doesn't really apply to Hyper-V at all.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a Windows Server thing, and then if Hyper-V is in there, so what? If VMware is in there, so what? If Zen Server is in there, so what? It doesn't matter. So it's really kind of strange to me that this does come up in the debate, because it feels to me like a lot of people don't understand that if you're properly licensed to run the virtual machine, then you can run Hyper-V on the hardware, period, full stop. Right? There's no... You didn't miss it. The only place you could ever mess up is if you're doing like a VDI deployment on Hyper-V server and you only license for Windows 10. But since they pulled Hyper-V server out of you can't do that anymore, then now you've got a Windows server deployment, and it's only going to run so long before it says, if you don't key me properly, I'm going to reboot every hour. So, it's just, otherwise you pretty much land in a place where I hate driving that into the ground.
That's that whole Hyper-V server decision. I'm still kind of questioning that, because there's so many people that ran open source workloads on top of Hyper-V server. For those that aren't aware, if you're not familiar with the Hyper-V stack, Microsoft used to have, I say used to because they recently made this change, they used to have a SKU in Windows Server that was called Hyper-V Server, not confusing at all, right? That basically was Windows Server with just Hyper-V and some of the storage components, right? Enough to run virtual machines, and it didn't require any licensing. You didn't have to license the host. If you brought any Windows VMs along, you had to make sure those were licensed. But again, for open source workloads, there was no requirement for licensing. And I mean, on the VMware side, I think Hyper-V Server, VMware keeps changing the name on me every time I look. Isn't it just called, at one point it was ESXi Free, I think. What's the free hypervisor called on the vSphere side now, Xavier?
I think now it's called like Free Hypervisor or something like that.
Yeah, they keep changing the terminology.
It's like it's a very slight change just to be confusing.
Right, exactly. Well, basically, Hyper-V Server was the competitor to that vSphere SKU. It's kind of the same thing, right? So we've kind of heard a little bit about the licensing changes on the Hyper-V side. Xavier, on the VMware side, if I compare the two, like, VMware has always been a little bit simpler in terms of licensing. I mean, you have a couple, last I looked at it, there were 5 clearly defined SKUs for vSphere. You had Essentials, Essentials Plus, Standard, Enterprise, and Enterprise Plus the last time I looked at it, which is probably a year or two now, but I think it's roughly the same still, isn't it?
Yes, so they've removed Enterprise, so now Enterprise is gone, so it's Enterprise Plus only.
Oh, okay.
And then you get the odd vRealize suite that you can get as well with it. But I think the biggest change was back in March of last year or so. It's funny what you said, Eric, about per core licensing being confusing, because VMware used to be licensed per socket. So if you had one socket, you'd pay 1 license, 2 socket, 2 license, easy. But then they realized that people found the trick that if you buy a single socket with like 48 cores, you only pay 1 license. So they said, no more. So we're gonna go with per CPU, but it's still per socket. So if you have 2 sockets, you need 2 licenses. But if your socket has more than 32 cores, you need another license on top of it. So it's like per socket, but with a limit of 32 cores, and then you have to buy another one. And they claim that it's to follow industry standards, which is fair. Microsoft is doing it, and lots of other vendors are doing it. but it certainly doesn't make it easier.
No, that's for sure. And I want to make sure I kind of address the elephant in the room here. You know, if I look at Microsoft and VMware licensing together, you know, through the same lens, let's be honest here. It's Microsoft that's making the licensing equation difficult, right? Because I mean, yeah, there's some complexity on the VMware side, and like you said, Zav, that you're still counting cores, but the licensing complexity really comes from, in my opinion, the Windows Server side of the house. Because even if I'm running a vSphere environment, I still, not only do I have to count cores for my vSphere licensing and choose one of those 5 SKUs, but now I have to go through the whole rigmarole of like, okay, how many cores am I licensing for Windows Server as well? Do I have to account for virtual machine mobility? So am I using vMotion? Yes or no? Likely. If you're not using vMotion, please go use vMotion. You know, and all of the red tape that comes with Microsoft licensing. Am I alone in that kind of that thought process, you guys? I mean, I'm not trying to blame Microsoft, but really, that's where the complexity is coming from in licensing either environment, right?
And then SQL. And then you got a SQL running on it.
Oh, no. Yeah, SQL. Yeah, that's that.
Yeah.
Yep.
To their defense, like, it's complicated and everything, but with the, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the Microsoft license, you get a lot more than what you get with vSphere. Like, I mean, if you get vSphere, you have to pay for your Microsoft licenses on top of that. If you just get your Windows Server data center license, you get S2D, you get Hyper-V, you get all these things. So I don't know if there are special licenses for software space directs or these kind of features, but it seems like just with the Hyper-V license, the Windows Server license, you get access to a lot of features. Yeah. Whereas with vSphere, you get the VMware license and the Microsoft license. So like the entry ticket is a bit steeper with VMware in that regard.
Right, yeah, and that's one of the points I wanted to bring up is like, you know, if you want to use VMware, I mean, you still have to buy the Windows licenses anyway, right? Because that's Microsoft doing what Microsoft does, throwing their weight around in the industry, right? And again, it sounds like I'm bad-mouthing Microsoft. I'm just, you know, that's the game, right? That's the game that they have to play to be in business. And you know, like to your point, Xavier, you know, you do get a lot with Hyper-V, Storage Spaces Direct when you license Windows Server. There are some features, some of the more advanced S2D features only exist in Windows Server Data Center. But there's not that many that are data center only. Typically, the choice comes down, when you're choosing between standard and data center, the choice usually comes down to how many virtual machines am I running, right? Do I need to run a lot of virtual machines and they're going to be, you know, moving around all the time? Then I'm probably going to go with data center. But if I have like, you know, I forget what the sweet spot is, Eric. Maybe you remember, but if I have, I think it's like what, 7 or 8 VMs. Depends on the cluster size, of course. But
depends
you know,
on your discount, really.
Right. But so basically,
that's where it gets confusing. If you're buying retail licenses, it used to be 11 at 11.
Gotcha.
Before you stand up 12, flip the data center. That's how it used to be. I don't know if it's that way today, but then of course everybody who qualifies for data center probably doesn't have to pay retail. So,
right. Yeah, that's very true. Especially in the MSP space, because the MSP is probably getting a chunk off the top from, you know, whatever supplier they're using, and then however much discount the end customer is getting, right? So, yeah, licensing always gets complicated, but I at least wanted to make sure that we kind of covered it. So, kind of circling back towards that question of licensing Windows Server in vSphere environments, the question always comes up, like, is it worth it to pay what I've heard some people call the VMware tax? Because you're paying a little bit extra to be able to run Windows Server on top of vSphere, right? And I mean, don't get me wrong, I love both platforms. Both platforms are highly mature, both platforms are great performance. I think the two situations I've run into where you could easily justify that extra cost for vSphere licensing is that, A, you already have existing investments in VMware. Maybe your environment already is running VMware, or VMware seems to have a lot more, I don't want to say native, but tighter integration with AWS. Maybe you have some services that are running in AWS, and that relationship you have there with AWS necessitates a little bit more of a leaning choice towards vSphere, right? I don't know what Xavier, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, actually. I think a big part of it is down to the fact that all these companies they run VMware. They're used to it. They're in-house guys. They have VMware skills. They have the VMware, the VCP, the VCAP, you name it, whatever VMware certification you can get. And once you invest that much time and resources, it's tricky to change. Changing to Hyper-V, you might save 30, 40 grand in terms of licenses. But how much will it cost to retrain all your workforce? Yep. How much will it cost to hire new engineers with with Microsoft skills? All these things. And if you're using side products, by side products I mean like vRise automation, VROps, NSX, all these virtualized type of things that enable you to do things. I think that's where you don't really get any value if you bring that to Microsoft, because I think it's a blend of whatever product you're using and the skills you have in house. It's a tricky one, but when you think about it, the VMware tax isn't that high when you put it this way.
Right. I think if I was setting up a new environment today, knowing what I know, from a knowledge perspective, I'd probably go Hyper-V every time just because I know Hyper-V really well. But if I was brand new to virtualization and somebody was looking at vSphere for their first environment, I don't know as if I'd push them very hard away from VMware, just because, and I've mentioned this to Microsoft product group people before, I kind of feel like the management story has always been a little bit stronger on the vSphere side, just because vCenter has always been a really nicely fleshed out product. It's single pane of glass management, whereas on the Microsoft side, to Microsoft's credit and detriment, there are a multitude of tools that you can use to manage the solution. Eric, you and I have talked about this before. Do I manage my cluster with Hyper-V Manager? Do I use Failover Cluster Manager? Do I use PowerShell? Do I use System Center Configuration Manager? Don't use System Center Configuration Manager, please. That's just my opinion. Again, my opinion. I'm sure it's a great product for those that it works well for, but I digress. I feel like I keep bashing Microsoft in this conversation. I'm not really. My MVP award status was originally in the I was a Hyper-V MVP originally before they moved to cloud and data center management. So don't get me wrong, I love Hyper-V. I just, whenever I use System Center Virtual Machine Manager, I go a little bit insane. Anyway, again, on the vSphere side, very clear management story. On the Microsoft side, you have choices, which is nice, but for people who are new to the platform, it brings up that question, what do I use? And of course, you have the new tool that's thrown in there as well, Windows Admin Center, which until recently, I would have argued maybe wasn't ready for prime time, which, Microsoft will roll out a product that covers 70, 80% of use cases, and then they fill it out from there. And I feel like it's finally at a place where you can use it easily. I was just using it the other day I spun up a new file server VM inside of my lab, and I used Windows Admin Center front to back of that whole process. I didn't have to leverage any of the old legacy tools. But again, it just kind of, I think if you asked me that same question in a year, I probably wouldn't have the same gripes. But as it stands right now, I feel like vSphere has a little bit better management story. I don't know. Am I off the mark there? Do you guys think?
No.
Yeah, the tooling on the management side for VMware, I think it's always been like a strong point and the selling points, because the learning curve is not maybe as steep. You don't have to know PowerShell commands and all these things, so maybe it's better for beginners, and entry-level engineers.
Yeah, I think the only management gripes I've ever had with ESXi in the past have to do with, one, when they had that temporary split between ESX and ESXi. There was a lot of confusion during that time period, right? But it was temporary. And then kind of the same thing happened when they were transitioning from the you had the old, I forget what the tool was, what language the tool was built on, the installable vSphere management tool, right? And then they transition, yeah, C#. And then they transitioned to a Flash-based web tool, which we all know where Flash ended up, right, into the garbage heap of IT history. And then there was a time period there where they had the HTML5 client, which is amazing, but it took them some time to get feature parity with the other two tools, right?
That was a mess.
Yeah, which, that said, it was all temporary, right? So, I mean, to their credit, they got there in the end. It just took them some time, just like any product, right? It's got to mature, right? So, all right, well, let's move on to our next topic of discussion here, and that is, we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, and that's some hybrid cloud integrations. So where I've at least seen it from where I'm sitting at the industry is Hyper-V obviously has really close ties to Azure. And even though you can now run some VMware workloads inside of Azure with some of their new announcements, I feel like in terms of clouds, VMware is more closely aligned with AWS. Is that kind of what you've seen as well, Xavier?
Yeah, that's definitely what we feel actually, because there's been lots of announcement this year with the vSphere 7 update. I think it was roughly at the time of update 1, update 2, I can't remember. But with this Cloud Universal new offering where you can integrate with different cloud providers. But yeah, VMware Cloud on AWS seems to be the big one. You can link your on-premise vCenter to your SDDC, to your cloud SDDC, sorry. And instead of using enhanced link mode, which is what you use on-premise, you would use a hybrid link mode. And then you can, vMotion your VMs pretty seemingly. You have your content libraries that are synced up. So it's pretty transparent. It seems to be pretty cool. I haven't got the opportunity to work with it yet, but yeah, it seems to be where things are going. Like the partnership between VMware and AWS seems to be pretty strong these days. There's VMware Cloud on Dell EMC as well, because obviously VMware is part of Dell EMC conglomerate. Right. But yeah, I think AWS is where the money's at the moment.
Right. Well then, Eric, I mean, on the Hyper-V side, I mean, there's obvious integrations there just through virtue of Windows Server itself, right? But you also have some new deployment options, I guess I would call them, in Azure Stack HCI, correct?
Yes. So this is going to be maybe where Microsoft does a lot of catch-up work, in that you're going to start to see a blurring of where on-premises ends and the cloud begins with Azure Stack HCI, if that makes sense. As you're standing up, I have this new service in Azure, and they're like, well, where do you want to run it? Now you get to choose, or you couldn't before. So Amazon does not have that in. And you'll also notice another thing, which is not necessarily Hyper-V, but kind of is the Windows Virtual Desktop, which is now Azure Virtual Desktop, I believe. I think they've renamed it again.
Windows 365. AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, is going to stick around, but there's this new, flavor of it, I guess I want to say, called Windows 365 that has a management layer stuck on top of it, basically. They've packaged it up nice and neat and given you a couple of different deployment options. That's because I don't know if you've ever stood up AVD. It's quite the undertaking, and the experience has not always been great. But I guess the new Windows 365 is supposed to make that a little bit easier. But anyway, sorry, I kind of jumped in there. I'll let you continue.
No, actually, that was really good to know, because I'm trying. I was just getting up to speed on AVD, and then they came out the Windows 365. I'm like, oh, okay, now I got to do that too. So I wasn't there yet. The thing is that, as far as I understand, the only entity on the planet that is allowed to host Windows 10 or forthcoming Windows 11 is Microsoft. So when you go to Amazon and say, hey, I want your VDI solution and cloud-hosted VDI, it's going to be more like the traditional remote desktop, where you pop in and you get Windows Server something or another in the desktop experience. And it is an apples and oranges, and nothing is comparable.
Right.
Especially when you say, I'm going to go over here to Windows 365 and I can run the exact same things in the cloud that I have been running on premises, which you couldn't do under a whole lot of times with remote desktop. It's like they just didn't function correctly in a remote desktop environment. I think we've all fought with that for years. So once you start bringing the people in, the individuals, and they get addicted to Windows 365, then it's going to suddenly say, well, why do we have so much of our infrastructure in AWS when we've got all of our people over here in Azure? And I think that could be a game changer, assuming it remains legal for them to do that.
Yeah, that's kind of the gray area right now, isn't it?
Yeah, I can see some people getting really fussy about it. I'm kind of surprised we haven't heard people complain yet that Microsoft has granted themselves this power that they've never granted anyone else. So
yeah, that, as much as I'd like to not believe it, but I feel like we're on the cusp of some new antitrust type of stuff. This isn't the first thing that's made me think that in the last couple of weeks. There's been a couple other things I'm kind of looking at. I'm like, really? That kind of doesn't feel warm and fuzzy from an antitrust perspective. But anyway, I hope that's not the case.
But you've been around lawyers; they don't understand software, so I bet what's going to happen is they'll file that suit and they'll get in there, and Microsoft's going to look at all these services Amazon provides that we have no analog for. Do we get to sue them for that? And then the lawyers will be like, oh, I guess not. And I think they probably know what they're doing. I think they're okay.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
For the time being. Yeah,
there's whole buildings full of lawyers over there at Microsoft. I'm sure they've thought about all of this.
Oh, I'm sure they have. I'm sure they have. And it's like, okay, well, if you require feature parity from us and we require it from you, and I think Microsoft is in a place where they're ready to start saying, hey, you know what? Due to all the antitrust laws against us, we're following all these rules that no one else is following. Time to have a chat. So,
right,
yeah,
very true.
It's going to bring interesting conversation for third-party VDI providers like Horizon, Citrix. How does it work? It's going to be tricky.
Definitely. I'm probably going to hurt the feelings of some Citrix folks out there, but personally, I won't feel bad if Citrix just went away. Now, that said, I'm still nursing some wounds from my Metaframe XP and my presentation server 4 days. So again, I'm dating myself a little bit. It's been a while. Maybe it's better than it was back then, but I digress. Anyway, yeah, one thing I wanted to touch on really quick on the Microsoft side there, with Azure is Azure Stack HCI. I wanted to just touch on that a little bit more, in that, like you said, Eric, when I deploy a new workload, from the Azure management plane, where do I want to put it, right? So now with the integrations that they have through Azure Stack HCI and Azure Arc, when I push down workloads from Azure, now my on-premises location where maybe I have an Azure Stack HCI cluster up and running shows up as a destination, right? So I can push down virtual machines. I think the goal is, and I think you can do it today, don't quote me on that, but I think you can actually deploy SQL databases like you do in Azure. And also there's support for Kubernetes now as well on top of Azure Stack HCI. So they're definitely getting on the container bandwagon in terms of hybrid cloud as well. So that said, I have been beating my head against the wall, getting Azure Stack HCI deployed in my physical lab here in the house for a while. So it's definitely not a fully fleshed out process yet. Maybe it'd be easier if I had, like an official integrated solution or something that's pre-canned, but I got a couple of super micro boxes. It meets all the requirements, but it's not all tied up in a neat bow like some vendors have their solutions set up, right? So that said, Azure Stack HCI, definitely I could see it being if it goes the way that they want it to go, I could see that being the way everybody deploys their Windows workloads on premises moving forward, and everybody starts using the Azure management plane for managing anything Microsoft, right? You can kind of see that's kind of where they're starting to push people. So whether you're on-prem or you're in Azure, they want you using Azure and cloud-based tools to manage those solutions. So, and I could see things like that on the VMware side, kind of, you know, it's kind of, Xavier, kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be going that way on the VMware side a little bit too, right? Where you've got, they've always had the concept of single pane of glass management, right? So kind of the similar thing on the VMware side. I don't know enough about AWS to know whether there's native, like, baked in tools in the AWS console, but not that I've heard of off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, it's kind of going this way, but the way they integrate with AWS, as in for VMware Cloud and AWS, is it's like having your physical servers running in AWS in the data center. You have your vCenter that's over there. You don't manage it. It's under the hood. And yeah, you have this infrastructure over there. You link your vCenter on premise to your vCenter in the cloud. And that's how things go. They've made it so transparent for the users to make it easier. And, you know, because the transition to the cloud, it's tricky for a lot of companies. They think, yeah, we do it later. We have time. It's a lot of work. So they've tried to make it a lot easier, you know, and keep the same tooling to manage it. They have some pretty nice products like DR as a service. So you can replicate your VMs to the cloud, to AWS, but you are not, you know, storing replicas. You are storing your disks on cheap S3 storage, and then you spin up an SDDC on demand. So you don't have to pay for the capacity to be running. So it's a pretty neat feature, and it's a lot less expensive. But yeah, it's still, you know, there's some adaptation and a lot of changes compared to fully on-premise environments. Right.
Well, cool. We've talked about a lot of stuff here, guys. A lot of comparison discussion, a lot of cool stuff, and some griping, mostly on my end. But one question I kind of want to end with, and that is, you know, again, if we're looking at these two ecosystems, right, VMware, Hyper-V, at the end of the day, does one choice over the other matter? I mean, if I look at it from my perspective, you know, I like both platforms. Both are highly performant. Both are solid. Both are mature. I'm probably going to pick whatever one I'm most comfortable with. Me personally, that's Hyper-V. I think choice of cloud may influence that decision as well. So if I'm already running stuff in Azure, that's probably going to drive me to choose Hyper-V. Same thing on the AWS and the VMware side. I guess, Eric, what are your thoughts in terms of choice?
Well, I always answer this question the same way. You are choosing which pain points are acceptable to you when you do this. It's not a matter of which one is better than the other, because somebody somewhere is sick of both of them. Right?
True. Yeah.
So, and that person may be the better person to listen to, but you might look down and say, okay, I personally have invested a lot of time in understanding WMI, CIM, that thing, and that underpins everything in the Microsoft world as far as infrastructure goes. So I can control Hyper-V at a level that really makes me just feel like I have the power. Yep. And so we were talking earlier about the failure of management, and I agree 100%. Graphically, they're so far behind. At scale, I feel like they're kind of ahead on that, because by integrating with a common WMI standard, you know, this is future-proof, and you can have people coming over because you can manage some Cisco devices that way. You can manage a lot of Dell products that way. I mean, this is a thing. This is an industry standard thing, and I don't feel like the CLI module for VMware is quite as far-reaching, if that's the correct way to look at it. But again, like you said, you come into it cold. vSphere, and I assume they chose the name Sphere to give you this idea that, hey, we've got all this stuff contained here. That's my guess, because that's kind of how it works. It's all inside this bubble. Microsoft, on the other hand, is like, here's a piece, here's a piece, here's a piece, and everything is like a big puzzle. It's not a sphere, it's a puzzle, right? And it's all jigsaws, and you got to snap everything together, and you may wind up at the same place, but you're not going to take the same path to get there ever, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at your products as, this is my virtualization stack, my virtualization management stack, all the things that plug into virtualization, I think VMware is the clear choice, right? But if you're like, I just need to deploy it, I got to manage my data center, I got to manage all of it, I got to manage Windows, SQL, my hypervisor, the hardware, everything, I got to do all that, then all of a sudden I think VMware is a little bit fuzzier because of the way that the product sprawl.
Gotcha. Yeah, good point. Good point. Xavier, same question to you. What are your thoughts on choice?
Well, it's the classic answer that no one likes and everyone hates. It's it depends. It's
Indeed, it does.
The perfect platform for someone will be the worst for someone else. There's, like you said, Eric, there's this sphere. It represents kind of, it's a nice analogy for VMware. They have everything tied up. It's done pretty nicely. You can plug in lots of different solutions. They don't have to be VMware. You can plug in lots of different third-party solutions. So yeah, that's a great way to run your environments. But like you said, if you have all these other services like SQL, Exchange, all these other Microsoft type services, that's going to be a completely different pipe of management. Whereas in VMware, you have the VMware management pipe. You get plugins to manage stuff in vCenter, but although VMware, they offer plugins to manage third-party solutions, they don't necessarily advise you to do so because it's not best practice. It's better to manage them with their own product tools. So yeah, I think VMware is great for people who have skills, who have lots of different products that connect to it. And Microsoft is great for those who like to tune it and don't really care about these management tools and these UIs and all these third-party integrations.
Yep. Sounds good. Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. Absolutely. It just depends, right? That's the magic IT answer in, well, I don't want to say just this year, but since the beginning of IT, right?
So, you have a choice. It depends. The only time it doesn't depend is when you don't have a choice. There's only one,
right.
So there you go.
That's right.
Buy it or don't. I guess it still depends.
Very true. Very true.
It's up to everything.
Right. Right. Well, hey guys, I want to thank you both for showing up and talking today. It's been a great discussion. It's always fun having these talks about the different platforms and kind of how they affect our lives as system administrators. And one thing I want to end with, if any of our listeners want to get a hold of you guys, where can they do so? I mean, obviously we've got the blogs, right? The Altera blogs, altera.com/hyper-v/VMware/MSP Dojo. We have a Office 365 dojo coming soon. We have a backup of DR dojo. We have a lot of different dojos that are popping up now. But besides the blogs, how do people get a hold of you guys? Eric, we'll start with you.
I really like public discussions, so maybe find me on the Altera, the dojo forums. That's always a good place. I'll respond best there. Okay. You can find me on Twitter. Handle is @Eric Siron. Should be pretty easy. I do accept LinkedIn requests, but I also know that my inbox is about 300 messages deep because so I get the request, but I probably am not going to read messages. So yeah, you take that how you will. But I think those are probably the best ways.
Gotcha. And then for those that are interested in the dojo forums, it's just dojoforums.altera.com is the URL for that. Eric is certainly more active there than I am, but I do hop on once in a while to help out when I can. So Xavier, how do people get a hold of you in case they want to touch base with you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. You can find me on my website as well, vixav.fr. And I'm also sometimes, roaming around the VMTN forums, VMware forums. So yeah, that's about where you can find me.
Sounds good. And then for those of you listening, don't feel like you have to really quick jot down something. I'm going to be sure to include a link to all of these different resources to get a hold of the guys right beneath this video if you're watching, or if you're listening, it'll be in the episode description as well. So you'll certainly have access to that. Other than that, I think that's it for us, guys. Again, appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming out, and everyone watching / listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll be sure to catch you again for a future episode of the Dojo Podcast. Thanks for listening.